from the Reynolds Journalism Institute at the Missouri School of Journalism. Welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. We're going to talk today about a huge humanitarian situation that many people in the West hear very little about. That's the continuing crisis in Yemen, where a civil war has left as many as 21 million people in need of humanitarian aid. That's 80% of the country's entire population. Aid agencies warn that the country is on the brink of famine, and recently cholera has begun to spread. At the heart of the problem is a conflict that began in earnest last year. That's when a rebel group known as the Houthis, allied with a former president, launched an offensive against the government of President Abdurabu Mansour Hadi. Eventually, Hadi was forced to flee the country. He has since returned. Now, a Saudi-led coalition armed by the U.S. has fought back, seeking to restore Hadi's rule. But the war has become something of a stalemate. Just days ago, UN-backed peace talks ended in failure. On today's edition of Global Journalist, we're going to learn more about this conflict that has largely been out of view in the world media from a number of people who have been following it closely. Up first is Sanaa Al-Hamdani. She's a writer and researcher for the news site Yemeniaty. She joins us from Washington, D.C. Sanaa, welcome to Global Journalist.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you lived in Yemen. It is on the Arabian Peninsula. It doesn't have a lot of oil like some of its neighbors do. Give us just a little bit of an overview of what conditions in Yemen were like even before this civil war.
Yeah, absolutely. So Yemen is a relatively young country. It became a country in 1990. Prior to that, it was actually two countries, South Yemen and North Yemen. In 2011, the country had an uprising very similar to the revolution that took place in Cairo and Egypt. The people were fed up with the presidency of former President Ali Abdullah Saleh, who ruled for 33 years. So when the uprisings took place in 2011, a lot of people took to the streets. A lot of political parties mobilized their youth and wanted President Saleh to step down. What happened is GCC deal agreement. The GCC is the Gulf Cooperation Council, decided to strike a deal where President Saleh steps down and his vice president, in fact, would become president. So the current president of Yemen, President Abdurabu Mansour Hadi, is the former vice president of former President Saleh. And they agreed that this switch would take place, and we held elections that were kind of just, one candidate election just to show that Yemen will continue to be a democracy. President Hadi came to power, and former President Saleh stepped down but decided to stay in the country, and the Gulf granted him full immunity where he couldn't be tried for any crimes that he committed, and was allowed to still operate in politics. What happened since is that the international community and the UN decided to help Yemen move forward in a transitional period. So this kind of process was held through the help of many, many countries, including the US, of course, and something known as the National NDC, National Dialogue, took place in Yemen, where 556 Yemeni figures came together trying to decide the shape and form of the next government. They were also supposed to solve and address the grievances that were taking place in the country. While this was happening, the Houthi militia that had engaged in war with former President Saleh, several wars prior to 2011, were also members of this National Dialogue Conference. The aim was to kind of bring all factions from Yemen together and to move forward in a consensus government that includes every type of Yemeni in it. What happened since is the Houthis decided to not have faith in the process, which of course was not as successful as the UN would portray it.
Well, if I could just stop you there and back you up just a moment. So there was this effort after the Arab Spring, the ouster of the former President Ali Abdullah Saleh, to have sort of a national reconciliation between the various groups in Yemen. Tell us just briefly, who are the Houthis? Why are they fighting now?
So the Houthis are a rebel group that was an insurgency at the very start. What they demanded at the start was pretty much rights. Their area, Sada, was neglected by the government, but it wasn't the only area in Yemen that was neglected by the government. There were many other areas in Yemen that were neglected, but they were able to mobilize and form this movement that followed their spiritual leader, who was known as Badr al-Din al-Houthi. His son was actually the founder of the movement, the Houthi movement, who then decided that they want They never, to this day, stated what they exactly want in Yemen. But it's very clear that they wanted an opportunity to participate in governance, especially in their own area.
Okay, so there's this group from northern Yemen. Correct me if I'm wrong. They're Shia Muslim, as opposed to people in other parts of the country are Sunni. And then they sort of moved down and took some big areas of land in Sanaa and south and in southern Yemen even. So what's happened with the humanitarian situation as a result of this conflict? We heard about just sort of enormous numbers of people in need of assistance now.
So first of all, the Shia-Sunnah conflict in Yemen was exaggerated at first. 45% of Yemen is Zaydi, which is a sect of Shia that is very similar to Sunni Islam. The rest are Shafi'is, which is a sect of Sunni Islam, and they were able to coexist together for many, many years. So the fact that they are Shia, we have to distinguish that they are very different, at least in their theocracy, from the Twelver Shia or the Shia in other areas of Yemen. Now, the humanitarian situation in Yemen is not a problem because of the Houthis per se. It is a problem because of corruption. It is a problem because the government neglected to take care of its population, to invest in its infrastructure. So regardless of this war, Yemen was going to face a humanitarian crisis. But what the war did is it exaggerated it and it made it so much worse. Now, the Houthis resulted in a civil war in Yemen where different geographical areas, populations in these different geographical areas started engaging in warfare against each other. But on top of that, you have the Saudi intervention coming in the form of bombs, and that's really what made the humanitarian situation worse.
And tell us, if you would, what are some of the most pressing needs in Yemen right now?
So first of all, the dropping of bombs in civilian areas needs to stop immediately. The people have been under bombs for 2 years, and the bombs are only targeting the northern portion of Yemen. In the south, there's a group trying to secede, and the government is capitalizing on their dreams and are not listening to them. All over Yemen, there is no sense of security. The government has absolutely no presence on the ground, which means that militias and terrorist organizations are taking advantage of the situation there. What needs to happen is an immediate ceasefire. There needs to be a peace deal in which different factions in Yemen on the ground, I'm not talking about the Yemeni government, which has been in Riyadh ever since the start of the war. I'm talking about local actors on the ground need to come together and agree on how they're going to proceed forward.
Well, there was just this UN effort at a peace deal. Our time does grow short, but if you could just tell me why did that fall apart?
So peace talks have been falling apart ever since the peace talks took place, and it's because every faction in Yemen is refusing to kind of compromise. They all want what they want. Now, the last peace talk is falling through, though, because President Hadi and his government are not agreeing to the terms of the peace. And that's because they are asking for a new form of government in which President Hadi will no longer lead it. And clearly, his government are not happy with that. They're not happy with the terms. They want the Houthis to completely withdraw from Sanaa and go back to Sada, which is very hard to imagine, especially because they want to continue expanding. And what needs to happen really is international pressure. A lot of the weapons are coming from the US and the UK, and they have a lot of say in this.
Well, Sanaa Al-Hamdani, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
A reminder that you're listening to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. We're talking today about the civil war in Yemen, a conflict that aid agencies say has pushed the country to the brink of famine. We're going to broaden our discussion now by bringing in 3 other people who have been tracking this issue. Joining us from Berlin, Germany is Laura Kasinof. She's a former Yemen correspondent who has written about the country for the New York Times and other news outlets, and she's the author of the book, Don't Be Afraid of the Bullets, an accidental war correspondent in Yemen. Also with us from New York is Akshaya Kumar. She's the Deputy Director of the United Nations Program for Human Rights Watch. And in Washington, D.C., we're joined by Nabeel Khoury, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Rafik Hariri Center for the Middle East. Welcome to all of you. Let me start first with you, Laura Kasinof. You spent several years in Yemen. Give us just a sense as to why this conflict is sort of invisible internationally.
I mean, it's a very good question, and it's something that is not a surprise to me at all. Yemen has always been sort of just off of the news agenda, but it's also off of the agenda of humanitarian organizations. It gets relatively little money when compared to other countries. In terms of international diplomacy, I would say as well, it used to be that the embassies in Yemen were stocked by very young sort of diplomats on their first posting. It just sort of always gets the short end of the stick. Why that is, I'm sure there's many reasons. It's difficult for me to say exactly, but this is just a continuation, really, of that trend. And it's a country that really only pops into the American and global news when there's a terrorist attack that emanates from the country or tries to emanate from the country, and then it just disappears. And I think it's whether or not it's because Yemen's confusing. It's just these things are part of a trend. And it's a country that people view isn't of such global importance, say like a country like Egypt, which has an important relationship with the government of Israel, and thus it becomes more important to U.S. News and politics.
Well, let me turn this to Nabeel Khoury then. We heard Sanaa Al-Hamdani. She sounded rather pessimistic about the prospects for peace in Yemen. How do you see things? Are we likely to see a military solution, that one side is going to defeat the other in the civil war here?
No, I don't think so. I think that was an excellent introduction to the political situation in Yemen by Sanaa. And exactly what she ended with about the need for US and UK pressure, particularly on Saudi Arabia, because I think a unilateral step by Saudi Arabia to stop the air war would not resolve everything, but would set the stage more positively for peace talks to follow. Unfortunately, again, what Laura was saying is that there is not enough attention given to Yemen, and that's not just by the general public, but also by the US government, which has sort of delegated over the past year the Yemen file to Saudi Arabia. I'm not confident that in the time remaining for this administration, that the Obama administration would have the time and the resources to devote to Yemen essentially diplomatically, because I do not think there is a military solution. The Saudis have put together basically an air war. They have not been able to field any soldiers on the ground in any significant way. And the bombing from the air is not enough. The Houthis have been able to withstand the bombing and have, in fact, taken over territory from Saudi Arabia. They're very good fighters on the ground, and they've given the Saudis a very hard time. So that means, I think, given the blockade on Yemen, given the southern forces arrayed against the Houthis, neither the Houthis nor the Saudis can win this war to an ultimate conclusion.
Well, let me just move this to Akshaya Kumar then, because we heard Nabeel talking about the Saudi air war, and your organization has been quite critical of the way Saudi Arabia has conducted that war. Tell us about that.
What we've focused on in the past year and a half has been exactly that. The way in which the war has been conducted by both sides has been horrific and in direct violation of the laws and norms that govern how wars are supposed to be fought. So in the case of the Saudis, bombs have dropped on schools, they've dropped on hospitals, they've dropped on factories where Yemenis were just going to work. All of these places where there was no clear military objective at all. From the Houthi side, their hands aren't completely clean. There's been indiscriminate bombardment, basically launching missiles across into communities that had civilians as well. But by and large, the majority of the civilian casualties have been caused by this indiscriminate and unlawful attack of the Saudi coalition, one that's especially affected children because bombs have fallen on schools. They've killed and maimed kids, kids who were clearly not combatants.
And this has also interfered with the effort to get aid to these 20-some million people who need it. I understand there's like one giant bridge that connected the capital Sanaa to the coast of Yemen, and where a lot of food had been brought in, and that was bombed just recently.
Yes, a couple of weeks ago, there was a bridge that the U.S. government had told its Saudi allies. And, in our analysis, the U.S. is directly a part of this war, not just because U.S. companies are selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, but because the U.S. is providing targeting advice and guidance and also refueling Saudi planes that are in the air as they're heading on their bombing runs to Yemen. And so the U.S. Told the Saudis, this bridge is really important. It's a bridge by which lots of life-saving humanitarian assistance flows. Please keep it on your do not hit list. And notwithstanding that, the Saudi planes ended up bombing that bridge in the span of a week, where they also bombed a school and a hospital.
Well, let me turn this to Laura Kasinof then. What are Saudi Arabia's interests in Yemen? Why are they involved in this war that seems so destructive?
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult question. I mean, there's many Yemenis who would say that the one thing that Saudi Arabia doesn't want is a stable democratic Yemen. I've heard that a lot, because that's a direct threat to the Saudi monarchy if that's the case. I mean, truly, Saudi thought that when the Houthis took over Sanaa, and in partnership with Saleh, who had become an somewhat perhaps enemy of the kingdom, though that's still debatable, that was a direct threat as well to the Saudi monarchy. The Houthis do have a ideological relationship with Iran, though that was overblown by the Saudis, whether intentionally or not, I don't know. And they were against the president of Yemen and put him under house arrest, who was working as an ally of Saudi, who's Hadi. I mean, in many ways, Hadi has very little legitimacy as president of Yemen, aside from, he was installed by the GCC that Sanaa mentioned and Western governments.
The GCC is the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is a Saudi-led regional organization.
Exactly. And he had very little domestic support to be president, and so that's and he did a very poor job as he was president. So the Houthis are a threat to Saudi, whether in their control of Sanaa is a threat to Saudi. Probably also just because they weren't going to do what Saudi wanted, and Saudi was used to having a leader in Yemen that did what it wanted.
If you're just tuning in, you're listening to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. Today we're talking about the major humanitarian crisis in Yemen, one that has received very little coverage internationally. Joining us are Laura Kasinof, a former Yemen correspondent who has written about the country for Foreign Policy and other news outlets. Also joining us is Akshaya Kumar of Human Rights Watch and Nabeel Khoury, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. If you want more Global Journalist, visit us online at globaljournalist.org. There you can find a new photo essay about Yemen's war by the Egyptian photojournalist Asma Wage. You can also connect with us on Facebook and Twitter, or subscribe to the videocast of this program on YouTube. Nabil Corey, let me turn things back to you, because we did hear our previous guest talking about the role of the United States and the UK in this conflict. Akshaya Kumar was saying that the U.S. has provided the bombs, the weaponry, and even refueled the Saudi planes that are conducting these airstrikes in Yemen. So I guess my question is, why? What are the compelling U.S. interests in Yemen that justify this sort of very significant indirect participation in the war?
Well, if you think strategically, the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula is strategically very important for the U.S. Because a lot of its forces are in the region, because on one side you have the entrance to the Gulf, and on the other side, nearer to Yemen, you have Bab el-Mandeb, the entrance to the Red Sea. The Saudis also have a very direct strategic interest there to protect these waterways, because that's where the oil flows and that's where international shipping flows. The problem, and the Houthis certainly were over-ambitious and made a dangerous move by occupying Sanaa and then moving down to take Aden. This was in 2014.
But is it clear that it would actually be harmful to U.S. interests, to Western interests, if the Houthis were to take control of more of the country? I understand the Houthis did have an exchange of missile fire earlier this past month with the U.S. Navy, but are they really a threat to the United States, to the U.K., to these shipping lanes?
Look, I mean, if you're thinking strategically from the US point of view, you have to assume that if the Houthis took over Yemen completely, Iranian guns would soon flow if they hadn't flowed already. And they would be at Bab el-Mandeb threatening international shipping from that side. And already Iran has the ability to close the straits in the other side of the Gulf. So this should have been, the US and Riyadh should have been alerted to this back in 2014 when the Houthis moved south. They did not threaten, they did not intervene, they did not send any diplomatic missions to try to dissuade the Houthis. The Houthis could have been dissuaded, but they were not. The US closed its embassy a few weeks after the Houthis took Sanaa. And then it pulled 300 special forces out of Al-Anad base, which is a base close to Bab el-Mandeb, the entrance to the Red Sea, a few weeks after that. Instead of leaving them there as a marker, as a red line, and telling the Houthis not to go further south. So I think there was a failure of diplomacy. There was a failure of taking steps to try to prevent a situation from developing further. And by the time the Houthis were at the gates of Aden in the south, it was too late to change that situation without going to war with them.
Well, let me move this to Akshaya Kumar then, because just to stay for a moment on this issue of these airstrikes by Saudi Arabia, there has been a lot of criticism of them internationally. And I understand at one point earlier this year, the United Nations sought to put Saudi Arabia on its so-called list of shame of countries that violate children's rights. And this is because the bombing campaign in Yemen has killed several hundred children. Tell us what happened there.
Well, in an unprecedented move, Ban Ki-moon, on the advice of his children's rights experts, said that Saudi Arabia, or rather the Saudi-led coalition bombing in Yemen, because of its killing and maiming of children, because of the attacks on schools, deserve to be on this list of shame that usually has bad actors like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, people who recruit child soldiers, the worst of the worst. And the Saudis were on the list for just a couple hours before they realized that this really put them in a bad light in the international sphere. And so they went directly to Ban Ki-moon and his advisors and threatened to pull out all of the funding and assistance that they provide in Yemen, but also in other places, including Palestine, where Saudi Arabia funds the bulk of the humanitarian assistance and work. And so by threatening them with this monetary basically punishment if they were to stay, if the UN was to keep them on the list, the Saudis were able to blackmail themselves off. And so just a few days later, Ban Ki-moon had to come before the world press and say, you know, this was a really difficult decision, but I had to remove Saudi Arabia from this list because I was under threat, and children in other places would have starved or gone without life-saving assistance. And this just shows the, you know, real influence that Saudi Arabia has on the way in which we're actually thinking and talking about this conflict, and the degree to which we can even admit the complicity of Western governments like the United Kingdom, like the United States in this war. I wanted to respond to something that Nabil said about the strategy, because I think the missing bit of all of this strategy is the long-term implications that these kinds of abuses and war crimes are going to have on the minds of Yemenis themselves. If the US government continues to support a coalition that is bombing indiscriminately and destroying the infrastructure of this country, although Yemen may be strategically important for shipping, it's also important for counterterrorism. We know that the Islamic State operates there, Al-Qaeda operates there, and both of these extremist groups will only be enabled in their recruiting.
Well, you raise a good point here, Akshaya, and I wanted to go to Laura to hear a little bit more about this, because Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula has been based in Yemen for some time. They have sought to carry out attacks on U.S. airliners. They're thought to have been the ones who organized the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris. So tell us, if you would, there has been some reporting that this conflict has actually allowed them to expand and become stronger within Yemen. So is this really in the U.S.'s long-term interest to sort of facilitate what's been going on there?
I mean, of course, that's a very good point. I mean, a stable Yemen and a Yemen without conflict obviously is something that is good for countering extremism in Yemen. And we've seen in Yemen, even starting, I mean, there were places of the country that had very limited government control, that were the places where these militant groups were able to act more freely in years past. And then as the government began to break down as a result of the protests in 2011 that were part of the Arab Spring, these groups were able to expand their territory. So of course, I mean, but the U.S. government has for like a very long time not acted in Yemen in terms of what's best for the long term, like that with like long-term thinking. It's definitely more so short-term thinking. And I think really right now in Washington, I don't know what the Yemen policy is. It seems to be quite confusing. All of it, you know, the only thing that we can understand is that it's that Hadi is legitimate president of Yemen.
Well, what do we know?
So,
has President-elect Trump said anything about this crisis? Do we have any sense as to where he might fall out in this?
I would not be surprised if Trump didn't know where Yemen was on a map. So I don't know if he, in terms of.
Well, let me turn this to Nabeel Khoury then. Our time does grow short. Where do you see things moving from here over the next year or two in Yemen? We have just about 45 seconds left.
Well, I think if the Obama administration does not move to end completely its assistance to Saudi Arabia, and I agree totally with Akshaya that this has more negative than positive implications for U.S. security, let alone for Yemen's security. But if they don't do that, I doubt that there's going to be much change with the Trump presidency. I agree he knows very little about Yemen and the region as a whole. If he buddies up with Putin, he's going to leave it to essentially what Russia wants to do or doesn't want to do. Saudi Arabia will continue on its aggressive posture in Yemen. Instead of essentially luring the Houthis with economic assistance, they are using a stick which is ineffective and encourages more war and encourages fosters.
I'm sorry, Nabil. We're going to have to leave it there because we are out of time for this edition of Global Journalist, a production of the Missouri School of Journalism and KBIA Mid-Missouri Public Radio. Many thanks to Sanaa Al-Hamdani, Akshaya Kumar, Laura Kasinof, and Nabeel Khoury. Global Journalist was produced this week by Federico Macchioni, Anna Suterer, Thomas Orihuela, and Jonah McCown. Anadil Iftikhar is our visual editor. Vera Tan is supervising producer. Pat Akers of KBIA is our audio engineer. Travis McMillan is director. For all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Jason McClure. Thanks for tuning in.